Chagiga Daf begins with a Mishnah, which is actually a transplant from Maseches Veitza, because it's really the halachos of Yom Tov. It discusses which karbanos you're allowed to bring on a Yom Tov and which you are not. It'll be a machlokas Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about two karbanos, karban ola and karban shlamim. In both situations, Beis Shammai is more concerned for the halachos of Chilul Shabbos and Yom Tov, even midrabanan, and Beis Hillel is more concerned with making those karbanos happen, even if you have to violate some otherwise applicable malachos. The Gemara will get into a different topic and bring proofs to that subject from our Mishnah. Topic the Mishnah is discussing is if you didn't bring a karban chagiga on Shavuos, can you bring it after Shavuos? The Gemara will bring a number of sources for and against that concept. So let's begin. There's a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about bringing karbanos on Yom Tov. Now, bringing a karban on Yom Tov means you have to slaughter the animal. That is a malacha. Malacha is permitted for food. And there's another malacha involved, which is smicha, and that is leaning on the animal, which is an issur d'Rabbanan of using an animal, working an animal. Now, according to Beis Shammai, we're very strict on these things, and therefore we do not allow any karbanos which we don't have to, and that are not for human consumption. So therefore, Beis Shammai says as follows: a karban ola you do not bring on Yom Tov. So a karban ola's re'iyah can't be brought on Yom Tov; it can be brought the day after Yom Tov. Even a karban shlamim you can bring on Yom Tov because you're going to eat it on Yom Tov. However, you cannot do smicha. Smicha has to be done before Yom Tov. It's okay, according to Beis Shammai, that you have a break, and there's a space between the smicha and the actual bringing of the karban chagiga, which is brought on Yom Tov, and that's okay. So therefore, we have two halachos of Beis Shammai. One, you do not bring a karban ola at all on Yom Tov, except of course for those karbanos ola which are designed for the Yom Tov. That is the karban musafim and the tmidim of the Yom Tov itself. But an individual's karban re'iyah and other karbanos ola he cannot bring on Yom Tov. And he can bring a karban chagiga, but not do smicha. Now, Beis Hillel is lenient in both of these. Beis Hillel says smicha has to be close to the karban, therefore he can do smicha on Yom Tov. There's no way around it, and therefore smicha pushes away Yom Tov as well. As far as the karban ola, he says that you are allowed to bring a karban ola, which is a karban ola re'ila. You're allowed to bring that on Yom Tov. Now, other karbanos which are not necessary, are not Yom Tov related, he would also say that you cannot bring, but it's not discussed in this Mishnah. It speaks only about karbanos shlamim and karbanos ola. Now the Gemara brings a specific case, which seems to just repeat these halachos, and that's what happens when Shavuos falls on a Friday. So according to Beis Hillel, there's no problem. You bring a karban ola, you bring a karban chagiga on Shavuos, so you can do whatever you want. It's Yom Tov. Now, according to Beis Shammai, though, you can't do it on Yom Tov. So generally, the chagiga, you could bring the chagiga on Yom Tov, but you do smicha before Yom Tov. But the karban ola can't be brought; it has to be brought the day following Yom Tov. But here, the day following Yom Tov is a Shabbos. So Beis Shammai says, therefore, that karban ola re'iyah has to be brought on Sunday. Now, if Shavuos falls on a Shabbos, then everybody agrees you can't bring the karban ola re'iyah on Shabbos. It doesn't push away Shabbos, and therefore it has to be brought on Sunday. However, we're concerned because the Tzedukim hold that Shavuos is always brought on a Sunday. They hold that Atzeres is always mimachras HaShabbos, literally, and therefore it's always on a Sunday. If we're going to be bringing karbanos olas re'iyah on Sunday, it will give the impression that the Tzedukim might have a leg to stand on. In order to prevent that from happening, the Kohanim, specifically the Kohen Gadol, would walk around in non-Yom Tov clothing to make it clear that it is not Yom Tov now, it's just a remake, it's a makeup day for the karban ola re'iyah, which you couldn't bring on Shavuos itself. Alright, now the Gemara begins. The Gemara is discussing the topic of what happens if one did not bring his karban chagiga on Shavuos as he is supposed to. So the Gemara is going to discuss, is there makeup time for 7 days Shavuos and 6 days that follow? So the Gemara knows that this is true for Pesach, as we've seen earlier in the Masechta. You can bring the karban chagiga any of the latter 6 days if you didn't bring it on the first day, and on Sukkot you can bring it any of the latter 7 days. You can even bring it on Shmini Atzeres. So the Gemara is going to discuss: are there 7 days after Shavuos? Shavuos is just a 1 day. Yom Tov, are there 7 days on which you can bring it? So the Gemara first quotes Rav Elazar named Rav Eloshi, who says yes, you can bring it for all 7 days, and the source is from a pasuk Tes b'chag Matzos, b'chag Shavuos, b'chag Sukkos, links the 3 of them to show that just like you can bring and carbon chagiga for 7 days on Pesach, you could bring a carbon chagiga for 7 days beginning Shavuos. Gemara says, well, maybe you should link it to Sukkot, and then you'll have 8 days. Gemara says, no, Shmini Atzeres is a separate Yom Tov, it's not part of Sukkot. Gemara says, it may be a separate Yom Tov, but that's only concerning the halachos of Pazar Kashav, Pei Zayin Reish, Kof Shin Veiz. But as far as the halachos of Tashlumin, you can bring a Tashlumin on Sukkot. So maybe we should bring that, so I have 8 days for the carbon chagiga of Sukkot, I should only have 8 days for the carbon chagiga of Shavuos. Just as far as what Pazar Kashav stands for, it stands for P.A.S., that there was a lottery drawn for which of the families would bring the karbanos of Shmini Atzeres as opposed to the other 7 days of Yom Tov. That's one way in which Shmini Atzeres is different than Sukkot. Zman is there's a bracha shachiyanu, there's a new shachiyanu, it's made on Shmini Atzeres, which was not made during the days of Chol HaMoed. Regular, it has a different name, it's called Shmini Atzeres, it's not called Sukkot. Carbon has different karbanos. Shin is shear, and that is that the order of the shira during the karbanos was different. It was not the same. And Beis is bracha. There was a special meaning to give a bracha to the king on Shmini Atzeres. Zecher to the bracha was given to Shlomo HaMelech on the Shmini Atzeres, in which the Beis HaMikdash was first inaugurated. So we're left here with a question, and that is, why don't we learn from Sukkot to Shavuos that you have 8 days for the Karban Chagiga? Why do you only say 7 days? So the Gemara says here we apply the rule tefasta meruba loy tefasta. Whenever you could take a lot or take a little, better off taking a little. That's the correct thing to do. So the Gemara says, so then why is the Sukkot written in this pasuk here? You're learning from Pesach to Shavuos. Good. Why is Sukkot in the conversation? Whereas Sukkot is here to connect the mitzvah of to connect Pesach to Sukkot, just like Pesach requires lina, that is, we cannot leave Matzah Pesach, cannot leave Yerushalayim. We have to stay until the day following. The Gemara elsewhere gives a drasha for that. Also, Sukkot, we cannot leave Matzah Pesach. We have to stay over one additional day following that. Okay, so that concludes this Gemara's source. Then the Gemara brings another source against the concept of having makeup days for 7 days for Karban Chagiga, and that's going to be from our Mishnah. So our Mishnah had said that when Shavuos falls on a Friday, Beis Shammai says there's no day of sacrifices afterwards. Now, Beis Shammai said there is. Beis Shammai said you bring the karbanos on Sunday, but Beis Hillel says there's ein lo yom tvach is the wording of the Mishnah. There's no day of karbanos. The Gemara says that implies that you're not allowed to bring any karbanos afterwards. It means that Shavuos doesn't have any makeup time. Because if you could bring a karban chagiga, why would Beis Hillel say there's no karbanos brought afterwards? There are. Karban chagiga could be brought any time if you forgot. So my answer is no. What it means to say is that it's not necessary to have any karbanos afterwards, because you could bring all the karbanos on Shavuos. Beis Hillel is teaching me you're allowed to bring all the karbanos on Shavuos. You could bring the ola and the chagiga both on Shavuos. The Gemara says that can't be what Beis Hillel is saying. That was the first part of the Mishnah. That machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai was first discussed in the beginning of the Mishnah. What is this adding? So my answer is no. This is adding that this machlokes applies even on Shavuos when it falls on a Friday, and you cannot bring the karbanos on the next day. You have to wait until 2 days later. You may think that Beis Shammai would here agree that you could bring the karban ola or the karban chagiga without smicha, with smicha. Well, smicha probably wouldn't change, but you could bring the karban ola. So we may think that Beis Hillel agrees you could bring the karban ola on Shavuos, because you don't want to wait 2 days till Sunday. So the Gemara therefore has to repeat, the Mishnah has to repeat that the machlokas exists here as well. The Gemara says, and he couldn't have just Beis Hillel say as halacha here, because then I would think Beis Hillel only says it in this case. I wouldn't know that Beis Hillel says you could bring the karban ola even on Yom Tov when it is in the middle of the week and you don't have to wait 2 days. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to its next proof on the subject. That's a brisa that says somebody who did not celebrate 7 days of Pesach or 8 days of Sukkot and 1 day of Shavuos, he cannot celebrate anymore. Celebrate here means bring a karban chagiga. So the Gemara says that it says 1 day. That seems to imply that there's only 1 day in which you could bring the chagiga. There's no makeup time for the chagiga. So the Gemara says no. What it means to say here is if you didn't celebrate the makeup day, if you missed the makeup time, then you can't do it anymore afterwards. But it's referring to the makeup day. It's not referring to the original day of Shavuos. The Gemara says, well, then it says only 1 makeup day, and you told me there are 7 makeup days. The Gemara says you have to change the language a little. It shouldn't say Yom Atzeres, which should say Yemei Atzeres. That is the days in which you could bring a carbon for Atzeres. Okay, the Gemara brings its fourth proof on the subject. Is a brayso brought by Rabbi Bar Shmuel, discussing connection between Rosh Chodesh and Shavuos. So he says that when we want to figure out which day Rosh Chodesh is and bring the carbon musafim of Rosh Chodesh, we count all the days in the month, and then we get to day number 30. That's Rosh Chodesh. Of course, it could also be day 30 and 31, but day number 30 is Rosh Chodesh. So now the Gemara says that the brayso continues, and it links that to Shavuos. Just like Rosh Chodesh, you count 30 days and you get to Rosh Chodesh. Shavuos, you count 50 days, then you get to Shavuos. Now the brayso says, each one, the amount, the time that you're celebrating is the thing that you counted. So the Gemara says, so this seems to indicate that just like on a month, you count 30 days and you celebrate a day, Shavuos, you count 30 days, you count 50 days and you celebrate a day, the things that you counted, and you bring the karbanos on a day. So you only have one day to bring karbanos, not longer. The Gemara says that's not true because you also count weeks. And the Gemara quotes Abaye that says that just like you have a mitzvah to count the days because it says Tisper Chamishim Yom, you also have a mitzvah to count weeks. We know that it says Shiva Shavuos Tisper Loch, and Chagiga Shavuos is what it's called. So it's called the Yom Tov of weeks, and you count weeks. So we definitely count a week. So we also celebrate for an entire week in which we can bring the carbon Chagiga. Okay, now the Gemara brings one more source, and that is Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, who says that the pasuk says, "Ukrasem." You should call Yom Tov on that day. Krasem etzem yom hazeh mekakodesh yelachem kol malachas vod lo yisasu chukos el mechol mesh v'yiseichem l'dareisechem. You should make it Yom Tov on this day. Don't do any malacha. This is referring to Shavuos. And the next pasuk says, "Bekotzuchem is katsir aretzechem," when you harvest the harvesting of your land. So you see a connection between Karasim and Kutzurchem. It seems to imply that on the Yom Tov that you're bringing, you can also do Kutzurchem. You can also harvest. So the Gemara says that doesn't make any sense. You can't harvest on any Yom Tov. And we know it's referring to Shavuos because Shavuos is the Yom Tov that is being discussed here. So the Gemara says it must mean that there are like kind of Chalamoid days of Shavuos. There are days which are Shavuos in some sense, but are Mutter and Malacha, and those will be these days that you're allowed to make up Karban Chagiga, but you do not have an Isser Malacha. So now the Gemara says, okay, so I have two sources in favor of the right to make up Karbanos on the days following Shavuos. We have this source of Rav Elazar ben Yaakov from the fact that there must be a day in which you're allowed to do Malacha, and we have the first source, which we began with, linking Sukkos, linking Pesach to Shavuos. So why do you need both sources? So Gemara says you need the source of that we just said of Rav Elazar ben Yaakov to show that these days you're allowed to do Malacha. It's not real Yom Tov. You need the source of that we brought at first, linking it to Pesach to show that it's 7 days long. Otherwise, I would just know that there's makeup days. I wouldn't know how many.